Okay, so these are toss-ups over the psychologists taken from NAQT's You Gotta Know These Psychologists. So let's go ahead and begin. I think that there are about 25 or so. There are 26 actually, starting now with question number 1. This man gave descriptive names to the 4 temperaments in order to study transmarginal inhibition, or the body's proclivity to shut down when faced with overwhelming pain and stress. This man cut several nerve endings in his extensive study of animal digestive systems, which won him a Nobel for medicine. This man actually didn't ring a bell to signal the animals he's best known for studying, but did collect their saliva as they responded to stimuli. For 10 points, name this proponent of classical conditioning, a Russian who trained dogs. And that is Ivan Pavlov. Toss-up 2. One posthumous publication by this psychologist contained the image of a black snake who accompanied Salome and Elijah. That Elijah figure would eventually transform into Philemon. He described a pairing of contrasexual opposites in another book. In addition to describing Syzygy, this psychologist described personality in terms of variations from 2 individual types, the introvert and the extrovert, and wrote about archetypes. For 10 points, name this author of Psychological Types who studied under Freud and proposed a universal memory accessible to the whole human race, the collective unconscious. And that is Jung, Carl Jung. Toss-up 3. Its inventor gained inspiration observing squirrels in Harvard Yard, and he has been accused of raising his daughter Deborah in one of these. An interesting effect was brought about by the experimenter's desire to save money on food, resulting in his creation of fixed ratio and fixed interval schedules. He found that, among other things, extinction occurred whereby the subject stopped pushing the lever when deprived of pellets. For 10 points, identify this device, which a certain behavioral psychologist used to study operant conditioning in rats. And that is the Skinner box of B.F. Skinner, the Skinner box. Toss-up number 4. One concept created by this thinker can be described with terms guiding friction and guiding principle, while his idea of understanding character development was elaborated in his work, Understanding Human Nature. This thinker described 4 modes of creating distance from problems and built on Jan Smut's idea of holism in his book, Social Interest. This thinker outlined the ways in which birth order supposedly influenced personality and claimed that individuals with neurosis suffered from an inability to achieve superiority. For 10 points, name this Austrian psychologist who split from Freud and developed the idea of inferiority complex. That is Adler, Alfred Adler. Toss-up 5. Its creator wrote that a person's philosophy of the future changes whenever one aspect of his theory dominates. The frustration regression principle is addressed by Clayton Alderfer's extension of it, the ERG model. Kurt Goldstein first introduced one part of this construct, the desire to realize one's abilities. Introduced by the author of Toward a Psychology of Being, its lower levels include esteem, love, safety, and homeostasis, stating that physical desires must be satisfied first. For 10 points, name this pyramidal construct culminating in self-actualization developed by Abraham Maslow's. And that is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Toss-up 6. This man examined the modifying effects of autoclitics in a book that describes speech acts and demand a characteristic consequence called mans. This man designed a rejected missile system driven by pecking birds for Project Pigeon. This author of Verbal Behavior denied the existence of autonomous man in a book that argues for cultural engineering through a scientific technology of behavior. Another work by this inventor of the air crib describes a group of planners, managers, workers, and scientists living in a utopian community vaguely inspired by Thoreau. For 10 points, name this author of Beyond Freedom and Dignity and Walden II, an American psychologist who developed the namesake box for operant conditioning. And that is B.F. Skinner. Toss-up number 7. With Alfred Kroeber, this man studied the Yurok Indians of California, and he would later win a Pulitzer Prize for a book subtitled On the Origins of Military Nonviolence. In addition to Gandhi's Truth, this psychologist also psychoanalyzed the life of a German theologian and young man Luther. He theorized that infants go through a stage of trust versus mistrust and collected his essays in Childhood and Society. The term identity crisis was coined by, for 10 points, what German-born psychologist known for his 8 stages of development. and that is Erik Erikson. Toss-up number 8. This thinker co-authored a book with Joseph Breuer which relates details about Bertha Pappenheim. This man borrowed Roman Roland's term oceanic feeling for the primary source of religious energy. This author argued that Moses may have been Pharaoh Akhenaten in the book Moses and Monotheism. In another work, this man described two compelling forces, a drive for life and a drive towards death, superseding his earlier theory of logic of instant gratification called the pleasure principle. This author of Civilization and Its Discontents described an impulsive element of the psyche called the id. For 10 points, name this man who described a royal road to the unconscious in The Interpretation of Dreams, the Austrian founder of psychoanalysis. And that is Freud, Sigmund Freud. Toss-up 9. Elton Mayo modeled this experimental clinical methods for his Hawthorne experiments. This man described himself as a genetic epistemologist and analyzed behavioral and operational schemata. He poured blue liquid into taller and thinner glass from an identically sized beaker to demonstrate his idea of quantity conservation. This psychologist's most famous theory describes the development of object permanence during the sensory motor stage, which precedes the preoperational and concrete operational stages. For 10 points, identify this Swiss psychologist who divided the development of children into 4 steps. And that is Piaget, Jean Piaget. Toss-up number 10. This psychologist examined the relationship between mechanistic science and human behavior in his work, The Psychology of Science, a Reconnaissance. Ideas such as uniqueness and perfection were included in this psychologist's lists of B-values which define one's being, and this humanistic psychologist developed the idea of moments of extreme happiness known as peak experiences. In A Theory of Human Motivation, he explained that people had to secure psychological needs, safety, love, and esteem before reaching self-actualization. For 10 points, name this American psychologist who developed a namesake hierarchy of needs. That is Maslow, Abraham Maslow, and his hierarchy of needs. Toss-up number 11. This work describes a widow suffering from throat pains who is treated rashly by Dr. M. This work cites an earlier essay about a boy who develops a phobia of horses called Little Hans. This book outlines the 3 elements of forming a rebus, which are condensation, displacement, and representation, in section titled Irma's Injection. This work discusses the process of secondary revision in which one's censorship inclination attempts to rationalize the tidal phenomena as a form of wish fulfillment. For 10 points, name this work that introduces the Oedipal complex and discusses a certain sleep event, written by Sigmund Freud. And that is The Interpretation of Dreams. Toss-up number 12. This man explained that one of his results by describing a cybernetic viewpoint and an agnetic state. This psychologist demonstrated social proof when he directed some of his students to look at the sky on a street corner. Mr. Walter Carnap was featured in one of his experiments, and the town of Sharon was central to another that started in Omaha and Wichita. Another of his experiments featured 4 prods, like it is absolutely essential that you continue, and features teachers that delivered 15 to 450 volts in shocks to learners. For 10 points, name the psychologist behind The Lost Letter, Small World, and Obedience Experiments. And that is Milgram, Stanley Milgram. Toss-up number 13. After performing one experiment, this man published Kinesthetic and Organic Sensations, a paper filled with colloquial and slang expressions. This thinker worked alongside Harvey Carr in an experiment that tested the transformation of voluntary motor responses to conditioned responses, which involved a rat running into a wall, making its eponymous kerplunk noise. Douglas Merritt was the subject of another of his experiments, which used burning newspaper, a mask of Santa, and a steel bar and hammer. That experiment was conducted with his wife, Rosalie Rayner, and caused its subject to develop a fear of rats and eventually all furry objects. For 10 points, name this father of behaviorism who conducted the Little Albert experiment. And that is Watson. Toss-up number 14. Based in part on a work by Kurt Goldstein and Henry Murray, it was first proposed in A Theory of Human Motivation and was expanded upon in 1970's Religions, Values, and Peak Experiences. It begins with the D category, which is further divided into safety, social, and physiological categories, the last and most basic of which includes eating and sleeping. Once these are satisfied, an individual can move towards growth needs with the goal of becoming self-transcendent. For 10 points, name the psychological hierarchy that popularized the term self-actualization. and that is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Toss-up 15. Walter A. Shelburne wrote of the theory of this in Scientific Perspective. The developer of this concept drew a schema showing it is the outer ring of a series of 6 concentric circles, just outside the 2 circles showing the anima and the shadow, with the ego in the center. Its formulator saw it as a biologically inherited repository of images and ideas that have existed since remotest times, which he termed archetypes. Formulated by Carl Jung, this is, for 10 points, what 2-word name of given to the shared repository that predates an individual's personal ego? And that is the collective unconscious, the collective unconscious. Toss-up 16. This writer used Ingmar Bergman's film Wild Strawberries to analyze issues faced by elderly people. Many years earlier, this person wrote about the development through introspection achieved by both Sigmund Freud and Martin Luther in his work Young Man Luther. A one-time patient of Anna Freud, he wrote that children can perceive what people really mean, and that they reward love and take revenge on hatred in his book, Childhood in Society. In his work, Insight and Responsibility, he wrote about the development of hope, will, purpose, competence, fidelity, love, care, and wisdom as the virtues that people develop during their lives. Name this developmental psychologist who wrote about 8 conflicts that people face at different stages of their life. And that is Erik Erikson. Toss-up number 17. C. Anthony Breaux cited a chapter entitled Prejudice and Hostility of one of this man's works as indicative of his unique sensitivity to feminism. One book containing chapters such as A Lupus Phobia and The Shock of Sex Knowledge, he detailed the confession of a girl's neurosis to a psychologist. In addition to the case of Ms. R., his interest in childcare is reflected in his education of children and his establishment of the first Viennese child-guided clinic. He is most noted for the idea developed in his Understanding Human Nature and the neurotic character, the primary type of which stems from a childhood sense of weakness. For 10 points, name this man whose inferiority complex formed the main tenet of his individual psychology. And that is Adler, Alfred Adler. Toss-up number 18. Nicholas McIntosh's predictions about attentional changes in this phenomenon were contradicted by the Peirce-Hall model. Kamen blocking, which inhibits this phenomenon, can be explained with the Rescorla-Wagner model of it. Latent inhibition limits the efficacy of this phenomenon, whose second-order variety involves 3 cognitive steps. An experiment co-led by Rosalie Rayner showed how it often causes stimulus generalization. This method of learning was demonstrated in an experiment where a loud noise led a baby to fear all white furry objects. John Watson's Little Albert experiment echoed one in which dogs were taught to drool at the ring of a bell via this phenomenon. For 10 points, name this psychological phenomenon discovered by Ivan Pavlov. And that is conditioning. Pavlov is classical conditioning, whereas John B. Watson is operant conditioning. So those are the 2 types of conditioning, classical and operant. Toss-up number 19. While working as an advertiser, this man coined the term coffee break for Maxwell House. A later experiment by this psychologist involved a noise heard when rats ran into maze walls that had been changed in length from previous runs. This lover of Rosalie Rayner and deviser of the Kerplunk experiment claimed that he could raise any of 12 children to enter whatever profession he desired. His most famous experiment led the test subject to fear all objects appearing white or fuzzy, even Santa Claus. For 10 points, identify this founding behaviorist psychologist who's classically conditioned little Albert by ringing a gong each time the child was held a white rat. And that is Watson, John B. Watson. Toss-up 20. This thinker erroneously proposed what he termed the seduction theory of neurosis. That, along with his belief that cocaine was some sort of wonder drug, led to disastrous results on patients like Emma Eckstein. The standard complete translation of this thinker's works was made by James Strachey. He claimed that technology makes people unhappy gods with prosthetic limbs. This thinker described a life drive competing with a death drive as Eros versus Thanatos. He also theorized in Beyond the Pleasure Principle that the death drive and the libido in perpetual conflict make up the human psyche. For 10 points, name this Austrian psychologist who famously pioneered psychoanalysis and uncomfortable theories like the Oedipus complex. And that is Freud, Sigmund Freud. 21. This man arranged for a 50-year-old psychology professor to provide the words for a 12-year-old boy's conversation via radio, whom he called a cyranoid. This man asked people in Kansas and Nebraska to send a letter containing instructions to keep forwarding that letter to someone who might know the target stranger in Massachusetts. He also devised a way to examine the prejudice towards socially undesirable groups by asking people to forward envelopes to entities such as Friends of the Nazi Party. Those are his small world and lost letter experiments. For 10 points, name the psychologist from Yale University whose obedience to authority experiment asked his subjects to administer electric shocks to actors. And that, of course, is Milgram, Stanley Milgram. Toss-up 22. A casual conversation with Alfred North Whitehead inspired a book by this man that was defended in a 1970 paper by his student, Kenneth McCorquodle. That work by this man discussed verbal modifiers called autoclitics and concepts of tax and mans. This man's book, Verbal Behavior, was criticized in the 1959 review by Noam Chomsky. This man wrote a novel in which T.E. Frazier guides a group of visitors around the title Utopian Community. This creator of Project Pigeon and the Air Crib wrote Walden 2. For 10 points, name this American psychologist who created a namesake box to study operant conditioning. That is Skinner, B.F. Skinner. Toss-up 23. This man worked with Barbel Inhelder to perform an experiment in which subjects were shown a 3D view of a mountain. This psychologist posited that people underwent accommodation or assimilation to adapt new information about the world into an existing schema. This psychologist identified the ability to realize an object was still there, even after its removal from sight. He found that ability, object permanence, was not present in those less than 2 years old. Pre-operational and sensory motor are among the stages of this man's theory of cognitive development for children. For 10 points, name this Swiss psychologist. And that is Piaget, Jean Piaget. Toss-up 24. This man published Studies in Word Association, a series of translated papers that discuss psychological experiments at the University of Zurich. This psychologist discussed the idea that events that appear to be causally unrelated are observed to act together in a meaningful manner, which he dubbed synchronicity in his Red Book and 7 Sermons to the Dead. The Myers-Briggs personalities test is based off of this man's research on introversion and extroversion. For 10 points, name the Swiss psychologist who described anima and animus as archetypes of the collective unconscious. And that is Jung, Carl Jung. Toss-up 25. This man's ideas influence George Leonard's human potential movement. This man included justice, aliveness, and effortlessness on his list of B-values, which are achieved through metamotivation. This man borrowed a term from Frank Manuel to describe fear of success, which he called the Jonah complex. This author of The Farther Reaches of Human Nature claimed that certain transient moments constitute peak experiences that hint at the highest possible level of fulfillment. He developed a scheme that starts with examples such as food and air in the physiological category and goes through 5 levels, the last being self-actualization. For 10 points, name the psychologist who ranked human desires into a hierarchy of needs. And that is Maslow, Abraham Maslow. Toss-up 26, the last. Though not a composer, this man used whistles, metronomes, and tuning forks in his work. He won a Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1904 for researching the digestive system, from which his most famous work stemmed. The term which he is most famous for introducing was actually a result of a mistranslation into English, which caught on when John B. Watson used it. He started the study of TMI, or transmarginal inhibition, an organism's response to overwhelming stimuli, such as stress or pain, relating shutdown points to temperament. In his most famous experiment, he paired a CS with a US, ringing a bell whenever meat powder was present. For 10 points, name the psychologist known for his conditioning of dogs to salivate. And that is Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov. So there it is, the 26 toss-ups. So those psychologists keep studying, keep getting better.